Kayla Unbehan. She had walked out of a 4th of July parade in a small Illinois town holding her mother's hand, and she was supposed to be back with her father the very next morning. That morning came, and she was not there. 6 years passed with no calls, no sightings, and no traces. Until a stranger in a North Carolina thrift store glanced at her face and remembered where she had seen it before. Kayla Unbehan had grown up in South Elgin, Illinois, a quiet suburb west of Chicago. Her parents had separated when she was very young, and the courts had granted primary custody to her father, Ryan Eserka. Her mother, Heather, held visitation rights, but was not meant to keep her for long stretches. Family members described Kayla as a soft-spoken and thoughtful child who was closest to her dad. On July 5th of 2017, Ryan drove to collect his daughter after her scheduled overnight visit. Heather never appeared with her. When calls went unanswered, Ryan reported them both missing, and within weeks, a felony kidnapping warrant had been issued out of Kane County. What followed was one of the strangest custodial cases local investigators had seen in years. Heather managed to keep herself and her daughter almost completely off the grid, leaving behind no meaningful digital trace, no financial trail, and no easy line of contact for anyone to follow. For 6 years, Kayla's name sat on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database alongside age-progressed images that estimated how she might have grown up. The case slowly widened into national coverage, and in late 2022, Netflix featured her in the reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, in an episode focused on parental abduction. Millions of viewers saw her face for the first time. In May of 2023, a customer walked into a Plato's Closet inside the Westgate Shopping Center in Asheville, North Carolina. She noticed a teenage girl at the counter and paused. Something about her looked familiar. She stepped away, opened the Unsolved Mysteries episode on her phone, compared the two faces, and quietly told a store employee what she suspected. Asheville police were called within minutes, and a short interview at the scene confirmed her identity. Kayla had lived under a different name for most of her time away. The customer who first spotted her did not immediately approach anyone at the register. She stepped outside to a quiet corner of the shopping center, pulled up the streaming episode on her phone, and rewatched several minutes to be sure of what she was seeing. Only then did she walk back inside and speak to an employee who alerted the store manager. Asheville officers were on scene within a short window. Kayla was interviewed briefly at the shop before being taken to the local station for verification. Officers later noted that she had been polite and cooperative throughout, but had appeared visibly startled at hearing her legal name spoken out loud. Within 24 hours, arrangements had been made for her father to travel to North Carolina. He arrived the next morning, and the pair returned to Illinois together shortly after. What was it about this case that made it so difficult to close? The lieutenant who led the local investigation would later note that most missing person cases leave a technological breadcrumb somewhere. Whether a bank record, a school enrollment, or a rental application, this one had almost none. He called it a rare kind of case, one that Asheville police almost never saw. Heather Unbehan was arrested on a fugitive warrant that same day and released on bond in North Carolina before turning herself in to authorities in Kane County, Illinois. She was formally charged with felony child abduction, a Class 4 felony under Illinois law, and the case moved slowly through the local court system. Jury selection was set to begin in August of 2025, when she changed her plea and admitted her guilt. Sentencing came in early October of that same year. Kane County Judge David Clement weighed her medical condition carefully, noting that she was underweight, that she had digestive complications, and that letters had been submitted from her doctor, her therapist, and her psychiatrist. He sentenced her to 2 years of probation and roughly 6 months of GPS monitoring, with no additional time in jail. She had faced up to 3 years in prison. A no-contact order was placed between her and her daughter as part of the terms. As of early 2026, Kayla is back in Illinois with her father, where she has been since the day after she was located. She has kept her life private and has not made public statements about the years she spent away. Her mother remains on probation. The case is often cited by the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as one of the clearest examples of how a single alert viewer can end a search that law enforcement, technology, and years of national coverage could not. Kayla's story turned on a stranger recognizing a face from a screen. The next case shows what happens when the only lead is a strand of DNA, buried in an old database, and the search stretches across 4 decades. Baby Holly Marie Klaus. For more than 40 years, a young couple's bodies lay identified only as unknown remains, discovered in the woods outside of Houston. Their parents in Florida never stopped asking what had happened to their infant granddaughter, who had vanished with them. It would take genetic genealogy, a newly formed cold case unit, and a woman working as a waitress in a small Oklahoma town before the family would finally have their answer. Harold Dean Klaus Jr., known to his family as Junior, was in his early 20s, and his wife, Tina Gail Lynn Klaus, was around the same age. The two had grown up in New Smyrna Beach, Florida, married young, and had recently welcomed a baby daughter they named Holly Marie. In late 1980, the couple decided to move to Lewisville, Texas, hoping for better work opportunities, and they took Holly with them. The last time relatives heard from them was October of that same year. Then the phone calls stopped. Letters went unanswered. When the family began pressing for information, they received a strange call from a woman who identified herself only as Sister Susan, claiming that Junior and Tina had joined a religious group and cut off all contact. Sister Susan later returned the couple's car to the family, but she offered no explanation as to where they were or where Holly was. In early 1981, 2 bodies were discovered in a wooded area off Wallaceville Road in Harris County, just outside of Houston. Their lives had been taken. Investigators had no identification, no missing person report that matched, and no infant at the scene. The bodies would remain unnamed for the next 41 years. The break came in 2021. Genetic genealogists Misty Gillis and Allison Peacock, working with a group called Identifinders International, used exhumed DNA and public genealogy databases like GED Match to build out a family tree. That work eventually pointed back to the Klaus family in Florida. In January of 2022, the couple in the woods had names again. But the question remained. What had happened to their baby? That was where the newly created Cold Case and Missing Persons Unit at the Texas Attorney General's office took over. Senior counsel Mindy Montford and Lewisville detective Craig Holloman began working outward from the family tree, following every branch until a single lead pointed them to a woman living in Cushing, Oklahoma. On June 9th of 2022, the anniversary of what would have been Junior's birthday, they walked into the diner where she worked as a waitress. She was 42 years old, a mother of 5, and had no idea that the parents who had raised her were not her biological family. Donna Casasanta, Holly's paternal grandmother, had spent every year since 1980 asking any authority who would listen what had happened to her family. She had contacted police in Florida, Texas, and Arizona over the decades, and had never fully accepted that Holly might be gone. When investigators finally called to tell her that her granddaughter had been found alive in Oklahoma, she reportedly asked to hear the news repeated several times before she would allow herself to believe it. She later described the timing, on what would have been her son's birthday, as a kind of gift from him. The family flew to Oklahoma soon after and met Holly in person for the first time. Officials at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children described it as a moment they had rarely seen in decades of cold case work. How does a case sit unnamed and unsolved for more than 4 decades before falling open in a matter of months? The answer, according to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, is a combination of 2 things that had not existed in 1981: the widespread use of genetic genealogy and dedicated cold case units willing to work old cases as if they were new. Together, those 2 forces closed a gap that police had not been able to close on their own. The investigation into the abandonment quickly established that the family who had raised Holly were not suspects in her parents' passing. Instead, investigators focused on a nomadic religious group known publicly as Christ Family, whose members had reportedly left Holly at a church in Arizona in the early 1980s. The 2 women who dropped her off were never publicly identified. As of early 2026, no one has ever been charged in the passing of Junior and Tina Klaus. The Harris County Sheriff's Office still lists the case as an open, active homicide investigation. And the Texas Attorney General's Office has said the search for those responsible continues. Holly was reunited with her biological grandmother, Donna Casasanta, along with her aunts, uncles, and extended relatives. She published a memoir in November of 2023 titled Finding Baby Holly, which described the strange decades between her infancy and her identification. She was featured on ABC's 2020 and in a special called Baby Holly Found. Today, she lives in Oklahoma with her husband and children. Where Baby Holly's identity was rebuilt from genetic databases and cold case detective work, the case that follows would fall open in a much simpler way. A message on Facebook sent by a young woman who had decided, after almost 14 years, that it was time to reach out. Jacqueline Hernandez. Her mother had spent nearly 14 years wondering whether her daughter was even still alive. Then one afternoon in September of 2021, a Facebook message arrived from a woman she did not immediately recognize. The woman said she was in Mexico, that she was almost 20 years old, and that she was her missing daughter. Jacqueline Hernandez had been born in the early 2000s and was growing up in Claremont, Florida. Her parents had separated years earlier, and her mother, Angelica Vences Salgado, had primary custody. Her father, Pablo Hernandez, was allowed visitation but was under specific court restrictions given his history of tensions with the family. On the afternoon of December 22nd of 2007, Pablo was granted a visit with his daughter. He never brought her back. Within days, the Claremont Police Department confirmed that both had disappeared and issued a felony kidnapping warrant. Investigators quickly suspected that Pablo had taken her south, across the border into Mexico, where he was believed to have family. From that point on, there were no confirmed sightings for almost 14 years. Jacqueline's mother refused to accept that her daughter was gone. She spoke to local media, worked with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, and pushed for the case to remain visible. She kept photographs of her daughter on public forums and continued to update the missing person databases as the years passed. Investigators said the case was unusually painful because so many parental abduction cases end quickly, one way or another, and this one simply did not. In the years between the disappearance and the Facebook message, Angelica had traveled to Mexico multiple times on her own to search for leads. She had spoken to relatives of Pablo's family, distributed flyers in border towns, and reached out to organizations that specialized in cross-border child recovery. None of it had produced a confirmed sighting. Investigators at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement later said that her tenacity was one of the reasons the case had remained on active watch lists rather than fading into the archives. When the Facebook profile finally appeared, Angelica initially thought it might have been someone impersonating her daughter. What convinced her was a small detail. The person on the other end of the message remembered a childhood nickname that only immediate family had ever used, one that had never appeared in a single news article or public record about the case. Then, on September 2nd of 2021, an unfamiliar Facebook profile sent a message to Angelica. The sender identified herself as Jacqueline. She said she was living in Mexico and she wanted to come home. She asked to meet her mother at the Laredo, Texas port of entry. Was this a real reconnection or a cruel trick after so many years? Investigators at first were cautious. Homeland Security investigations, Customs and Border Protection, the Orange County Sheriff's Office in Florida, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and Laredo Police coordinated a plan to verify her identity before any public reunion. On September 10th of 2021, at roughly 5 in the afternoon, Angelica walked into a secured area at the Laredo port of entry and saw a young woman she had not seen since her daughter was a young child. DNA and identification checks confirmed what her heart already knew. Pablo Hernandez has never been located. As of early 2026, he remains at large with an active kidnapping warrant filed by Claremont Police. Investigators believe he is still living somewhere in Mexico, though his exact whereabouts have not been confirmed publicly. The Claremont police chief at the time described the reunion as an example of what could be achieved when multiple agencies across 2 countries chose to keep working an old case rather than closing it, though he acknowledged that justice for the abduction itself remains incomplete. Jacqueline has not spoken publicly about the years she spent in Mexico, and the family declined most media interviews after the reunion. Very little is known about what she was told during those years, what name she used, or how she came to understand that she had been taken. What was made public is that at some point, she began piecing together her own history and made the decision entirely on her own to reach out. As of early 2026, Jacqueline lives in Florida with her mother. Angelica has described the reunion as the answer to nearly a decade and a half of prayer. She has also credited social media, imperfect and inconsistent as it can be, with reconnecting her family in a way that no other tool ever managed to. The Claremont Police Department still lists the case as active because of the outstanding warrant against Pablo, and they have said publicly that they hope one day the second half of the case will close as well. The message from Jacqueline arrived by choice. The next case would arrive by accident, on a homeowner's security camera, in a vacant Colorado driveway that a mother and her partner had assumed was empty. Abdul Aziz Khan. A homeowner in a Colorado suburb was checking the security feed on his vacant, for-sale property one afternoon in February of 2025 when he noticed 2 adults and 2 children in the driveway. They did not appear to be with a realtor. When deputies arrived to investigate what looked like a routine trespassing complaint, they slowly realized they were standing in front of the answer to a 7-year-old missing child case that had spanned 11 states. Abdul Aziz Khan, known to his family simply as Aziz, had been born in 2010. His father was a physician in the New Orleans area, and his mother, Rabia Khalid, had taken a job in Atlanta, Georgia, prompting the family to move for her work. The parents were in the middle of a difficult custody dispute, and by late 2017, that dispute was expected to fall in favor of his father. On November 27th of that same year, Rabia was scheduled to appear in court for a custody hearing she was expected to lose. She did not attend. Instead, She and her partner at the time, a man named Elliot Blake Bourgeois, sold the family's vehicles, packed up their belongings, and disappeared with the child. A felony warrant was issued out of Kenner, Louisiana in 2019, and the United States Marshals Service picked up the case in 2020. Their investigation would eventually stretch across 11 states. For years, the family had almost no information at all. Aziz's face was featured on the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children database. In 2022, the case was included in a Netflix reboot of Unsolved Mysteries, which brought the story to a larger audience. Still, no confirmed sightings surfaced. Rabia had, according to investigators, taught Aziz to avoid interactions with strangers and to use different names in different places. On the afternoon of February 23rd of 2025, a homeowner in the Highlands Ranch area of Douglas County, Colorado, saw activity on his security camera at a home he had listed for sale on Kellywood Way. When deputies from the Douglas County Sheriff's Office arrived, they found 2 adults and 2 children in a car in the driveway. The adults claimed to be there in connection with a realtor. Their story slowly unraveled over the next 4 hours as deputies tried to verify their identities. By the end of that stop, both adults were in custody, and the identity of one of the children had been confirmed as Aziz Khan. The United States Marshals Service investigation into Aziz's disappearance had spread far wider than the 11 states routinely cited in press coverage. Investigators had followed leads into border communities, examined utility and lease records under a wide range of aliases, and worked with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children to distribute updated age-progressed images every year. Rabia Khalid, according to court filings, had frequently changed the family's location, sometimes within weeks of arriving at a new address. The Colorado stop, when it finally came, was described by federal officials as the kind of ending that no amount of national coverage had been able to produce on its own. It had taken a homeowner, a security camera, and a set of deputies who had refused to rush a routine trespassing complaint. That combination, more than any single investigative technique, had brought the case to a close. How does a case that had crossed 11 states end at a routine trespassing complaint? Sheriff Darren Weekly would later credit his officers for what he described as their sharp attention to detail, saying that a less patient stop might have let the group leave the property with their identities unchecked. The Douglas County District Attorney's Office added that the child, at some point, appeared to have been coached on what to say to law enforcement, which had slowed the process further. Rabia Khalid and Elliot Bourgeois were both booked into the Douglas County Jail, with bonds set at $1 million each. District Attorney George Brochler announced that Bourgeois would face 14 charges, including second-degree kidnapping, forgery, identity theft, providing false information, and trespassing. Khalid would face 9 similar counts. Notably, she was not charged with kidnapping her own child, which the DA explained was because Colorado law does not allow a parent to be charged with kidnapping their own son or daughter. A preliminary hearing was set for March 27th of 2025. As of early 2026, the final outcome of that case has not been made public, and it appears to remain pending in the Colorado 23rd Judicial District. Aziz was placed into protective custody along with the second child, who was described only as a family member whose identity has been withheld. He was reported to be in good health. Reunification with his father, who had not seen him in nearly 9 years, had begun through the courts, though the family requested privacy and has not made further public statements. His family has publicly asked that he be allowed to heal and adjust without media attention. For Aziz, the ending came from a suburban security alert in the United States. The next case would end on a rain-soaked country road in southwest France, and it would begin with a delivery driver who stopped to give a stranger a ride. Alex Batty. A young man was walking through the rain along a dark country road in southwest France in December of 2023 when a delivery driver pulled over to offer him a ride. The young man asked to borrow a phone. He said he had been off the grid for more than 6 years, and he said he needed to call his grandmother in England because she was almost certainly the only person left who knew who he was. Alex Batty had been born in February of 2006 and had grown up in Oldham, in the north of England. His parents had lived unstable, unconventional lives, and by the time he was old enough to remember much, he had been placed in the legal guardianship of his grandmother, Susan Caruana. His mother, Melanie, and his grandfather, David Batty, neither of whom held custody, held only limited visitation rights. In late September of 2017, Susan agreed to let Alex go on a short family holiday to Malaga, Spain, with his mother and grandfather. The trip was supposed to last around a week. On October 8th of that same year, the three did not board their return flight. Alex was last seen at the port of Malaga. Within days, Greater Manchester Police had opened a child abduction investigation, and by early 2018, his mother and grandfather were formally named as wanted. What followed was more than 6 years of nearly complete silence. The family moved through parts of Morocco, Spain, and finally into the mountains of the southwest of France, living in what was described as a nomadic, off-grid spiritual community. They grew their own food, relied on solar panels for electricity, and moved often. Alex would later tell a British newspaper that as he got older, he had come to find the lifestyle increasingly frustrating. On the evening of December 13th of 2023, a chiropractic student named Fabien Accidini, who was working part-time as a delivery driver, was traveling through the region of Chalabre in the Ariège. He noticed a young man walking alone in heavy rain. He pulled over. The young man got in, borrowed his phone, and asked to call his grandmother. Fabien then drove him directly to the local police station. By the evening of December 14th, French authorities had formally confirmed his identity. Greater Manchester Police announced that Alex Batty, missing since 2017, had been found alive. Fabien Accidini would later describe the moment he first noticed Alex on the road as unremarkable at first glance. He had seen many walkers in the area over the years and had assumed at first that this was simply another one caught out in bad weather. It was only when Alex borrowed his phone and asked to call a grandmother he had not spoken to in more than 6 years that Fabien realized what he had walked into. He drove Alex directly to the local police station and stayed with him until officers had taken over. In the BBC documentary that aired in 2026, Alex retraced parts of the route he had walked, revisiting several of the villages and hillsides where the family had lived during their years off the grid, and speaking, at times for the first time on camera, about what those years had meant to him. What is it about a case like this that ends quietly, on a country road, rather than through a police raid or a dramatic tip? The answer, at least according to Greater Manchester Police, is that not every long-term missing person case ends in a familiar way. Some, especially those involving family members and nomadic lifestyles, end because the person at the center of it decides for themselves that they are ready to come home. Greater Manchester Police opened a formal child abduction investigation in December of 2023, but by January of 2025, they had closed it. In consultation with the Crown Prosecution Service and the National Crime Agency, the force concluded that there was no realistic chance of criminal prosecution and that the family, including Alex himself, did not wish to see charges pursued. Melanie Batty was never charged, and she is believed to still be living an off-grid lifestyle in an unknown location Alex, for his part, told the Sun in the days after his return that he had initially given a partial account of his escape in order to protect his mother from legal consequences. As of early 2026, Alex is back in the United Kingdom, reunited with his grandmother, and is now a young adult. He has recently become a father. He also agreed to appear in a BBC documentary called Kidnapped by My Mum, which followed him as he retraced his journey through the mountains where he had spent much of his teenage years. The documentary revealed that he had recently reconnected with his mother for the first time since his return. Not subscribed yet? Now's the time. And if audio's more your thing, find us on Spotify too. You can click the link in our bio. Sean Hornbeck. He was riding his bike down a rural Missouri road on a warm October afternoon when a white pickup truck pulled up beside him. He would not be seen by his family again for more than 4 years. And when he was finally found, it would not be because of a tip from a stranger or an escape or a break in the case. It would be because another child had gone missing. Sean Hornbeck had grown up in Richwoods, Missouri, a small rural town southwest of St. Louis. His mother, Pam, and stepfather, Craig Akers, described him as an easygoing child who loved being outside and riding around the winding country roads near his home. He was close to his family and had shown no signs of running away. On October 6th of 2002, Sean had been out riding his bike near his home. According to what he would later tell investigators, a white pickup truck pulled alongside him and knocked him off. A man got out, produced a firearm, and took him. That man was Michael Devlin, a manager at an Imo's Pizza in the town of Kirkwood, Missouri, roughly 55 miles from where Sean had been riding. Devlin brought Sean back to his apartment in Kirkwood and told him that if he tried to run, he would not survive. According to prosecutors, Devlin extracted a promise from Sean early on in exchange for his life. A promise that Sean's stepfather would later describe as a deal made with someone monstrous. For the next 4 years and 3 months, Sean lived openly in that apartment, presented to neighbors and acquaintances as Devlin's son. What made the case so difficult for many people to understand later was the fact that Sean was not, in the strictest sense, kept locked up. He had internet access, was allowed to use a phone, and over time was let outside. But he did not run. In the years after his recovery, Sean was asked repeatedly why he had not run when opportunities appeared. His answer, given in a small number of televised interviews, was consistent. He had been told from the very first days of the captivity that any attempt to leave would end in his own death. And he had believed that threat with a total conviction. A forensic psychologist who reviewed the case later said that the combination of an early act of violence and a threat delivered in isolation was one of the most effective mechanisms captors used to secure long-term compliance from a child. She characterized what Sean had experienced as a survival response, executed by a young mind that had been given no clear path out. Public understanding of the case shifted, slowly, in the years that followed. How does a case like this go so long without a single person suspecting something was wrong? Investigators would later explain that the appearance of an ordinary father and son household, combined with the early threat on his life, created a situation in which nothing about the outward setup ever raised a neighbor's suspicion. To the world, Devlin was a working manager living with his son. There was nothing to report. On January 8th of 2007, another child, William Ben Ownby, was taken from a school bus stop in Beaufort, Missouri. Ben's friend, Mitchell Holtz, gave police a careful description of a white Nissan pickup he had seen at the scene. The FBI traced the vehicle back to Michael Devlin. On January 12th of 2007, agents arrived at Devlin's Kirkwood apartment. Both boys were found alive inside. The press quickly named it the Missouri Miracle. Michael Devlin pleaded guilty in October of 2007 to a long list of charges spanning 3 Missouri counties and the federal court system, including kidnapping, multiple felony sexual assault charges, armed criminal action, attempted murder, and federal charges related to child exploitation material. On December 21st of 2007, United States District Judge Gene C. Hamilton imposed 170 years on the federal counts alone. In total, Devlin received what is commonly cited as 74 life sentences on top of that 170-year federal term. He is currently held at Crossroads Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri, and was stabbed by another inmate in April of 2011. As of early 2026, Sean Hornbeck is a grown man in his 30s, married with a child of his own, and has kept much of his adult life private. He and his family founded the Sean Hornbeck Foundation, which supported families of missing children before being folded into a wider Missouri search and rescue effort in 2013. In a rare public interview years after his recovery, Sean said that what had kept him alive was a belief that his family would never stop looking for him. Sean's case ended because another child was taken, and the search radius happened to overlap. The next case would take more than 3 decades to close, and it would end in a Connecticut apartment building because of facial recognition software that had matched an old missing person photo to a modern face. Jermaine Allen Mann. For 31 years, a mother in Brampton, Ontario, had believed her son was almost certainly dead. His father had taken him during a court-ordered visit and disappeared into the United States, and it would take a piece of facial recognition software, running an old missing child photo against a modern face, before he would learn that the mother he had been told was gone had been waiting for him all along. Jermaine Allen Mann had been born in the mid-1980s in the Greater Toronto area. His parents, Lyneth Mann Lewis and Alan Mann Jr., had separated when he was still an infant, and his mother had been granted primary custody. His father, a dual Canadian and Ghanaian citizen, was allowed brief supervised visits. On June 24th of 1987, Alan Mann Jr. took his young son for what was scheduled to be a routine visit. He never brought him back. Instead, he crossed into the United States, forged a false Texas birth certificate under an assumed name, and told his son that his mother had died shortly after childbirth. For the next 3 decades, Jermaine lived under the name Haley Randolph D'Souza. He grew up in the Bronx, then in Jamestown, North Carolina, and finally, from 2004 onward, in a federally subsidized housing complex in Vernon, Connecticut. Meanwhile, in Ontario, Lyneth Mann Lewis never stopped looking for her son. She worked with the Missing Children Society of Canada, gave interviews, and pushed for the case to remain on national watch lists year after year. Family members later said that she spoke of her son as if he were about to walk through the door, even as the years quietly turned into decades. In October of 2018, the Toronto Police Fugitive Squad, led by Detective Sergeant Wayne Banks, along with the United States Marshal Service, began running Jermaine's old missing person photograph through modern facial recognition tools. That work, combined with tips from relatives, produced a match. When investigators approached the Connecticut apartment, they confirmed that the man living inside was the child who had disappeared from Toronto more than 30 years earlier. Police described it as, at the time, believed to be the longest-running parental abduction case in North American history that had ended with the child alive and safely recovered. How does a father keep a child hidden in plain sight for more than 3 decades, receiving public benefits, enrolling in schools, and holding steady addresses without a single system flagging his identity? A federal investigation would later find that Alan Mann Jr. had received roughly $126,744 in HUD housing assistance and approximately $52,970 in Medicaid benefits, plus additional Medicaid payments on his son's behalf, while living under the assumed name for nearly 30 years. The Department of Justice investigation into Alan Mann Jr.'s decades under the assumed name revealed a life carefully built to avoid scrutiny. He had used the forged Texas birth certificate to obtain a Social Security number, and had then used that number to access federal housing assistance, Medicaid, and other public services. Investigators noted that the total amount he had received in benefits over the years was, in itself, an unusually large sum for a case of identity fraud, and that the true scale of what had been avoided was not the money at all, but the entire life his son had been prevented from knowing. Court documents from the Connecticut proceedings also revealed that Jermaine, once told his true identity, had struggled with the emotional weight of the revelation for months and had needed time before he could bring himself to speak to his mother by phone. In August of 2019, Alan Mann Jr. pleaded guilty in the United States District Court for the District of Connecticut to one count of making a false statement. On November 14th of that same year, United States District Judge Janet C. Hall sentenced him to 18 months in federal prison and ordered restitution totaling roughly $34,744 to HUD and $18,512 to Medicaid. In February of 2020, he was extradited to Canada to face a single count of abduction in Ontario, where he made his first court appearance in a Toronto area courtroom. As of early 2026, the final disposition of the Canadian abduction case has not been made public. It is unclear whether a plea, conviction, or withdrawal has been entered on that charge. If still living, Alan Mann Jr. would now be in his early 70s. Jermaine, a resident of Connecticut in his 30s, was reunited with his mother in 2018 after learning the truth about his own identity for the first time. He briefly attended his father's court hearing in Toronto and left without commenting to reporters. On social media, he described the emotional weight of learning that his mother had been alive all along, and spoke openly about the depression and anxiety he was working through in the aftermath. His mother, at a press conference alongside the Missing Children Society of Canada, thanked the agencies that had never let the case go cold. Jermaine's case ended when new technology caught up to an old photograph. The next case would end in a very different way, on a university campus, when a parole officer noticed something strange about a man he was supposed to be supervising. J.C. Dugard. She had been walking up a hill toward her school bus stop in a small California town on a summer morning when a couple pulled up in a gray sedan. What followed was one of the longest child abductions in American history. And for 18 years, she would live in a hidden backyard compound behind a suburban home, less than 3 hours from where she had disappeared. J.C. Lee Dugard had been born in May of 1980 and was growing up in South Lake Tahoe, California, with her mother, Terry Probin, and her stepfather, Carl Probin. Family members described her as a shy, warm child who was close with her mother. On June 10th of 1991, J.C. walked up the hill toward her bus stop. A gray sedan pulled up. Inside were Philip Garrido, a paroled sex offender, and his wife, Nancy Garrido. According to what J.C. would later describe, they used a stun gun to subdue her, pulled her into the car, and drove roughly 170 miles to the town of Antioch, California. There, they took her into a series of hidden tents and sheds concealed in the overgrown backyard behind the home of Philip's mother. She would be held there for 18 years, 4 months, and 16 days. During her time in captivity, Philip Garrido subjected her to sustained sexual abuse. She had 2 daughters, both of whom were born inside that backyard compound and raised believing that JC was their older sister rather than their mother. The Garridos gave JC a new name, Alyssa, and told her that this was who she was now. On August 24th of 2009, Philip Garrido visited the University of California, Berkeley campus with his 2 young daughters, hoping to arrange permission to hold a religious event. A campus staff member named Lisa Campbell and a campus officer named Allie Jacobs found the trio strange. The children seemed unusually withdrawn and rehearsed. Campbell and Jacobs alerted Garrido's parole officer. Summoned to a parole meeting on August 26th, Philip Garrido brought JC and her 2 daughters with him. Over the course of that meeting, he confessed. JC then revealed her true identity, and the daughters were told, for the first time, who their mother actually was. How could a compound of tents and sheds sit hidden behind a suburban home for 18 years, when a paroled sex offender was supposedly being visited routinely by parole officers? A later investigation would find that parole officers had made dozens of visits to the Garrido home over the years, without ever discovering the concealed area behind it. That failure would become the basis of what came next. On April 28th of 2011, Philip Garrido pleaded guilty to 1 count of kidnapping and 13 counts of sexual assault. Nancy Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and 1 count of sexual assault by force. On June 2nd of 2011, El Dorado County Superior Court Judge Douglas Phimister sentenced Philip Garrido to 431 years to life, and Nancy Garrido to 36 years to life. The judge described Philip as a poster child for the kind of sexual predator the state parole system had failed to properly supervise. Both are reportedly first eligible for parole in 2034. Philip Garrido had first been placed on federal parole in 1988, following an earlier conviction for rape. Federal supervision of him ended in 1999, and California state authorities then took over his parole. Records made public after the case revealed that Garrido had been visited routinely by parole officers during JC's captivity, and that none of them had ever examined the concealed area behind his home. That failure sat at the center of the $20 million settlement California approved with her, which passed with a vote of 30-1 in the state Senate and 62-0 in the state Assembly. JC has since used a significant portion of that money to fund her foundation, and has said publicly that the settlement was never really her money at all, and that it belonged in truth to what her family and her daughters had lived through. In July of 2010, the California legislature approved a $20 million settlement with JC, passed by wide margins in both chambers and signed by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger in acknowledgement of the state's failures in parole supervision. JC also filed a separate complaint against the federal government in September of 2011, arguing that federal parole authorities, who had overseen Philip Garrido for over a decade, had been similarly negligent. As of early 2026, JC lives in California and has spent the years since her recovery writing, speaking, and running her nonprofit. She founded the JYC Foundation, an acronym for Just Ask Yourself to Care, which offers therapy and support to families recovering from trauma. She wrote 2 New York Times best-selling memoirs, A Stolen Life and Freedom, My Book of Firsts. She has also publicly pushed back on the widely used framing of Stockholm Syndrome, preferring instead to describe what she experienced as an adaptation process. Her 2 daughters, now adults, have chosen to remain private. JC's recovery came because someone chose to trust an instinct at a university event. The next case would end at a neighborhood grocery counter, when a young woman finally decided to tell the owner of the deli exactly who she was. Tanya Nicole Cash. For 10 years, a young woman lived in a bedroom on the second floor of a McKeesport, Pennsylvania house, hidden from a family who never knew she was there. She had been groomed by a school security guard while she was still a student, and she had grown into an adult under his control. When she finally walked into a neighborhood deli one afternoon in the spring of 2006, no one there knew that the customer they had been welcoming for months was, in fact, one of the region's longest missing children. Tanya Nicole Koch had grown up in the McKeesport area of western Pennsylvania. Her parents had divorced, and by the time she was in middle school, she was struggling with a sense of not being wanted at home. She was a student at Cornell Middle School, where she came into contact with a man named Thomas John Hose, a security guard employed at the school. On February 10th of 1996, Tanya was reported missing. In reality, she had gone with Jose to the home he shared with his elderly parents and his own son. For the next decade, Jose kept her almost entirely confined to a single upstairs bedroom. His parents, who lived on the lower floor, did not initially know she was there. As the years passed, Jose eventually introduced her to the outside world as his girlfriend, under the assumed name Nikki Allen, and allowed her limited, curfew-bound outings. For much of the 10 years, Tanya was confined almost entirely to a single upstairs bedroom in the Jose household. She has said publicly that she went for long stretches without seeing sunlight, and that Jose's parents, who lived on the lower floor of the same house, initially had no idea she was upstairs at all. The two adults would only learn the truth about her presence after several years had passed. It was the Sparico family who first noticed that something about the young woman coming into their deli under the name Nikki Allen did not match her story. Joe Sparico's wife had felt it first, mentioned it to her husband, and then, over the course of months, quietly built enough trust that Tanya finally felt able to say who she was. Investigators later described the family's patience as the single reason the case ever closed. During those outings, Tanya befriended a local grocery and deli owner named Joe Sparico and his family. On March 21st of 2006, she quietly told Joe her real name and her real story. Joe contacted a missing children's hotline and, separately, told his son, who was a retired police officer. 3 days later, on March 24th of 2006, Thomas Hose was arrested. What does it look like when a child's disappearance falls through the cracks because the systems around her are not talking to each other? Tanya had been a registered student, then a missing person. And yet, in the same neighborhood where she had lived, no one had connected the girl on the flyer to the young woman in the upstairs bedroom of a house they walked past every day. In 2007, as his trial was preparing to begin, Thomas Jose pleaded guilty to a long list of charges, including statutory sexual assault, 3 counts of involuntary deviate sexual intercourse, 2 counts of indecent assault, and 1 count each of endangering the welfare of children, corruption of a minor, interference with the custody of children, and aggravated indecent assault. Allegheny County Judge John Zatola sentenced him to 5 to 15 years in state prison. He served the maximum, spending all 15 years incarcerated, and was released in 2022. Upon release, he registered as a sex offender under Pennsylvania's Megan's Law Registry. Tanya also filed a federal civil lawsuit in September of 2006, naming Jose and his parents, his security employer, the McKeesport Area School District, and City of McKeesport police officials. The case was dismissed at the summary judgment stage, largely on statute of limitations grounds and a ruling that Jose had not been acting in his official capacity as a school security officer at the time he took her. In December of 2009, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed the dismissal. At sentencing, when Jose attempted to argue that Tanya had thanked him for saving her from a difficult home life, Judge Zottala told him plainly that he was giving himself far too much credit, and that the way he saw himself was not the way the world saw him. As of early 2026, Tanya has earned her GED, obtained her driver's license, taken college courses, and married in 2018. She remains estranged from her father and stepmother, whom she has said blamed her for her disappearance. She co-wrote a memoir called Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, published in 2011. A Lifetime film based on her story, executive produced by fellow abduction survivor Elizabeth Smart, aired in June of 2024 under the title The Girl Locked Upstairs. Tanya's case ended because she took the first step herself, deciding, after 10 years, that she was ready to trust someone. The story that follows predates most of the others in this list by decades. It is also the only one in which the survivor saved another child on his way out. Stephen Stainer. A young boy was walking home from school in Merced, California, one December afternoon in 1972, when a man approached him claiming to be collecting donations for a local church. What followed would be a 7-year captivity that could have easily ended in silence. Instead, it ended with the boy at the center of it choosing, one night in 1980, to save another child from the man who had taken him. Stephen Gregory Stainer had grown up in Merced, California, the middle child of Delbert and Kay Stainer. He had been walking home along a route he took every day when a stranger stopped him with what sounded like a routine request. That stranger was Irvin Edward Murphy, a naive co-worker of a man named Kenneth Eugene Parnell. Parnell, a registered sex offender with a prior conviction for a similar crime, was waiting in a white Buick nearby. On December 4th of 1972, Stephen was lured into that Buick under false pretenses. Parnell drove him to a cabin in Cathy's Valley, in the mountains of Mariposa County. Over the next 7 years, Parnell moved him from town to town across California, including stops in Santa Rosa and Campeche. He gave Stephen a new name, Dennis Gregory Parnell, presented himself to neighbors and schools as his father, and enrolled him in local schools under that identity. Parnell also told Stephen that his real parents no longer wanted him and had legally given him up. Stephen, who had been very young when he was taken, believed him. Kenneth Parnell was already known to law enforcement when he abducted Stephen. He had a prior 1951 conviction related to a child, one that had made him a registered sex offender long before the day he pulled up in Merced. Investigators would later question how someone with that record had been able to enroll a child in schools under a false name across multiple California counties without any system flagging his identity. On the night of the escape, Stephen had thought carefully about how to get Timmy away without being caught. Parnell was working a security shift some distance away, and Stephen judged that they had a window of a few hours. They hitchhiked in the dark and rain, moving from one ride to another, until they finally reached the outskirts of Ukiah, where Stephen led Timmy directly to the front door of the local police station. For more than 7 years, Stephen lived under that assumed name and was subjected to sustained abuse. The people around him had no reason to suspect anything unusual. In February of 1980, Parnell abducted a second child, a young boy named Timothy "Timmy" White, from the town of Ukiah. He brought Timmy back to where he and Stephen were living. Stephen, unwilling to let another child endure what he had endured, decided to escape with him. On the night of March 1st of 1980, while Parnell was working a night security shift, Stephen took Timmy and fled. The two hitchhiked roughly 40 miles to the town of Ukiah, where Stephen walked into a police station and asked for help. In a written statement, he told officers that he was fairly certain his first name was Stephen, and that his last name might be Stainer, and that if he had a middle name, he did not know what it was. That statement would later give a book and a television miniseries their title. What happens when the person responsible for a child's disappearance never receives a sentence that fits the scale of what was done? Kenneth Parnell was tried in 2 separate California proceedings in 1981, convicted of kidnapping both Stephen and Timmy, and sentenced to a total of 7 years in state prison. He was paroled after serving only 5. He was never charged with the years of abuse itself, in part because most of it had occurred outside the Merced prosecutor's jurisdiction, and in part because the statute of limitations had run out. Mendocino County declined to prosecute. Parnell would eventually return to court decades later. In 2004, at the age of 72, he was arrested and charged after attempting to purchase a very young boy from a caretaker for $500. The caretaker's sister reported him. He was convicted of 3 felonies under California's 3 strikes law and sentenced to 25 years to life. Timmy White, then an adult sheriff's deputy, testified. Stephen's earlier trial testimony from the 1980s was read into the record. Parnell died of natural causes on January 21st of 2008 at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. Stephen Stainer married Jody Edmondson in 1985 and had 2 children. He worked with child abduction prevention groups and consulted on a 1989 television miniseries about his life, titled, "I Know My First Name is Stephen." On September 16th of 1989, Stephen was struck by a car while riding his motorcycle and did not survive. The driver received 3 months in jail for hit and run, but was acquitted of manslaughter charges. Timmy White, the child Stephen had saved that night in 1980, later served as a Los Angeles County Sheriff's deputy and was a pallbearer at Stephen's funeral. Timmy passed away in April of 2010 of a pulmonary embolism. Stephen's older brother, Cary Stainer, was convicted in 2002 of 4 murders committed in the Yosemite area and sentenced to death. That case is separate from Stephen's, but is often referenced as the strangest turn in a family that had already been through more than most. Every one of these survivors made it home against odds that had seemed impossible for years and sometimes decades. Thanks for watching. Click here to see our next video.